Hello, is it working? Can you hear me? Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the second day of the conference. We'll start the second day with our third keynote. We've already had two very stimulating and thought-provoking keynotes yesterday. And today we are very pleased to have Danny Roderick with us. I had the pleasure of reading his lecture in his keynote in advance, and I can assure you that it's very interesting and thought-provoking, and therefore I will try to keep my introduction of Danny very short, very brief, both because Danny hardly needs an introduction, but also because I want to make sure that he has enough time to develop his arguments, and also that we have enough time to take questions and discuss his points. So very briefly, Danny has been for a very long time the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He took a brief break for 2 years to become Professor of Social Studies, the first Albert Hirschman Professor at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton. But after this break of 2 years, he came back to the Kennedy School of Government. He's known for his research and his extensive writings on globalization, political economy, growth, and development. And what makes Danny truly unique is that he straddles academia and policy. He's one of the very few people who managed to write in a way that's appealing to academics, so his writings are rigorous from an academic point of view, and not surprisingly, they have been published in all top journals of economics. But at the same time, they have a feature that tends to be rare sometimes, unfortunately, in academic writings, namely, they are policy relevant and they speak to the questions of the day. In addition to having published extensively in all major academic journals, he also has written many op-eds, many columns. He has participated in public debates, and he has also written many books. His most recent book is Straight Talk on Trade. And I think he's going to draw on some of the ideas that he presented in this book in his current keynote. As you know, this conference is about multilateralism. And multilateralism, as I said yesterday in my opening remarks for the conference, is facing many challenges today, perhaps its biggest challenges in its history. Some are calling for reform of the system, and here I'm thinking mostly of the WTO, but to a certain extent also about the World Bank. And some people are even calling for its complete dismantlement. And against this background, it's very natural for us, especially for those of us who work for a multilateral institution, to speak in defense of the system, to try to point out its main virtues and the necessity of maintaining international cooperation, global governance, and a system of multilateral institutions. Danny is going to take a more nuanced view. He's going to present a more nuanced view on this issue. And rather than talking about the failures of the current multilateral system, as many have done, he's going to raise the question of whether the issues, the main challenges we are facing today, call for a multilateral approach as opposed to a more nationally oriented approach. So with this very brief introduction, I will turn the floor over to Danny and let him develop this argument further.
Let's see. So I hope I can find my presentation here. I don't see it. But let me begin by thanking Penny and Shanta for their invitation and for asking me to talk to you. It's always great, a privilege and fun to be at the World Bank. But this is the first time I'm having the privilege of sharing the platform with John Maynard Keynes. So I'm particularly happy about that. I'm not sure Keynes would have needed a name badge in 1944 saying my name is John Maynard Keynes. But I was told before we started that there are many people at the bank who actually don't know what John Maynard Keynes looks like. So I suppose that's the objective. This reminds me of the last time I think I gave a paper at the ABCD. It was a very, very long time ago and doesn't implicate anybody who works at the bank currently, certainly none of the senior administration, but I remember distinctly my paper disappearing. It was, again, on the topic of multilateralism. I think it is the interest of the bank now to have my presentations appear, otherwise I may have more stories. Maybe what I'll do is I will start, and without the benefit of the slides, I will steal the copy of the paper from Penny. This will remind me of what I was going to say. The central question that my presentation addresses is how should we draw the line between the national and the international? What should be regulated domestically, nationally? What should be regulated globally? There is a kind of a vernacular case for global economic governance that goes roughly in the following way, which is that we live in a world that's increasingly interdependent in economic terms. Everything that we do here affects things on the other side of the border. In a world with such economic spillovers, it's natural that we should have more global economic governance, and that essentially most problems that we encounter in the world economy today arises from the fact that we have not built those robust institutions of global economic governance yet. And if I had my slides, I would show you a couple of quotes from respectable and somewhat less respectable people making that case to suggest that it's not just a kind of a fantasy of my own imagination. Let me begin by making one important distinction about things that I'm not going to talk about, since this is a conference on multilateralism. There's one very important element of multilateralism that I'm not going to touch, and that's the issue of non-discrimination. This is probably the most important element of a multilateral approach to any kind of international cooperation, which is that principles or agreements that you arrive at apply equally to all others, and that you don't discriminate. That, of course, in the trade regime takes the form of MFN. There are various exceptions to that, but I think this is the value of MFN, or non-discrimination in general, that's embedded in the notion of multilateralism, as opposed to bilateral or regional approaches, is something that I'm just setting aside. As I said, the question is essentially what matters should be covered by global governance and what from, thank you, by national. These are my quotes. So this is, I've already said what I will be focusing on. The other thing I should make clear is that this is really about economic policy. There are a lot of other issues in the world that I'm not going to be talking about, so my focus is on things from trade to international money and finance to economic regulations to fiscal policy and so forth. So the notion that just because we have these spillovers, that necessarily creates a foundation or a need for global economic governance, I think is belied by the fact that there are so many things that have such effects of creating spillovers that we naturally take for granted that we actually don't regulate internationally. So here are some examples of policies that could be pursued domestically. Educational policies, highway speed limits, gasoline taxes, to things that we associate more with international regulation, but agricultural subsidies, import tariffs, or tax havens. Now, it's not entirely clear why the first three of these policies should be considered primarily national, whereas the next three are typically thought of being sort of in the global economic governance domain. I would argue that none of the principles that actually you might think of initially as to how that dividing line is drawn don't make a good job of discriminating. So it's simply not about the presence or magnitude of the spillovers, because a large country, even a domestic policy like a highway speed limit for a large country that might have significant impact on the world price of oil, much more of a spillover toward the world economy than would be the case for import tariffs for a small country. Similarly, with respect to whether there is harm to other nations or not, I think many policies that we think of as should be governed globally, such as subsidies, on balance, actually provide benefits to other countries and not harms. So why do we deal with them? I'll come to the specific case of subsidies later on. Whether the objective of policy is domestic or international, aside from the fact that it's actually very difficult to discern, many things like educational policies are pursued, or R&D policies are pursued from the vantage point of gaining international competitive advantage. That seems to be like an international objective. But why do we think that countries should be able to freely undertake R&D policies or human capital policies, even though it affects their comparative advantage, and by implication the comparative advantage of every other nation, do that freely? And whereas in many other domains we think that similar spillovers naturally come under the heading of global economic governance. So we don't actually, we need more principled conceptual divisions. So I'm going to argue that we need to sort of create some clear buckets of policies. I'm going to distinguish between global public goods, beggar thy neighbor policies, and then somewhat newer categories of beggar thyself and enrich thy neighbor kinds of policies. I'm going to argue that the global public good, or loosely similar global commons type arguments for global economic governance, actually in vast majority of economic policy domains actually don't apply, that the world economy is not a global commons in the way that we think about it, in a way that's analytically relevant. The beggar thy neighbor justification for policies is a serious one and does cover some policies, but actually most economic policies don't fall into that bucket either. And that was going to lead me to sort of the core argument that I want to suggest, that is that most of the economic failures that we discussed today as sort of being the world economy's failures are actually failures that arise from domestic governance failures rather than lack of international cooperation or the weakness of international governance. And furthermore, that even appropriately crafted global economic governance arrangements have very little, can have very little useful purchase or positive contribution to domestic governance. I I'm going to argue that a far better perspective for thinking about how we think about global economic governance is that to think of them as pursuing a somewhat different agenda or different model than what I think we have pursued over the last quarter century or so, which is that instead of having a kind of a globalization enhancing global governance arrangements which tend to pursue the reduction of transactions costs associated with national borders, to a kind of a democracy enhancing set of global rules which actually try to enact procedural requirements or procedural norms in the way that countries undertake their policies without taking a stand on what the outcome of those procedures are. So allowing countries wide latitude in the decisions they make, simply making some demands on procedural grounds that are more consistent with globally acceptable or globally recognized norms of democracy. Okay, so let me just a little bit of machinery here, so to make sure that we're all on the same page. Think about a world with two countries, home and foreign, and they have policies. Home countries' policy action is A with a subscript H, and foreign policy is generically AJ. They have payoffs. These payoffs critically depend both what a country's own policy, but also depends on the way that I've expressed it as the sum total of all the other countries' policies. And that's, of course, where the spillover comes, that a country's well-being is affected not just by its own policy action, but also the policy actions of other countries. And that spillover could be positive or negative, but that's the nature of the issue, that there is a discrepancy in the effect of policies and the structure of jurisdictions as currently drawn under the nation-state system. This immediately leads to the result that in this kind of a world, a decentralized equilibrium where every country is maximizing its own utility function is going to lead to inefficiency. And the typical kind of remedies that we think about this problem of externalities or spillovers in the domestic context, which is the use of Pigovian taxes or subsidies, are going to be unavailable in a global context for a variety of reasons having to do with the difficulty of having cross-border transfers or other sort of practical issues. This is the nature of the program, the nature of the problem. The major sort of one big category of such problems, of course, is the case of global public goods. Here, the externality or the spillover takes a particular form. So imagine that that the weighted sum of all the other countries' policies contribute to a global public good, G, or it could be negative, a global public bad. Then, essentially, for each country, the incentive for a country to contribute to that public good is going to be trivially low, that in the sense that each country is going to simply internalize the effect of its policy on its own direct outcomes, but is going to ignore the contribution to the global public good in the limit, of course, if a country's share in that global public good is very low, then that second term is going to diminish, is going to go to zero directly. So the global public good is going to be underprovided or not provided at all. And in this case, each country would be better off under some kind of global economic governance than in a regime where they all act unilaterally. Okay. The canonical case of this, of course, which I'm sure was the focus of the first keynote speech yesterday, is climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. If you think about A, this policy action as a control on greenhouse gas emissions, what this logic implies is that each country looks at only the direct effects of its greenhouse gas emissions policies on its own welfare, ignoring the contribution to the global climate, and since those emission controls have a cost economically, they are minimized. So the AH, this action would be the minimal that's feasible. Now, when we look at economic policies and the kinds of things that we typically talk about, none of the economic policies that I can actually think of fit under this definition of a global public good or a global public bad. Because remember, what's happening with a global public good is that a country is underinvesting in a particular policy because it is not taking into account the contribution to the global commons or the global public good. But take, for example, free trade and focus on the case of a small country, because I'll come to the large country optimum tariff case a little bit later in the context of beggar-thy-neighbor policies. But for a small country, what is the individually rational, individually utility maximizing welfare level of that policy? Is actually free trade. That small country is going to therefore pursue the policy that is, if you believe that every country pursuing free trade essentially maximizes the global commons or the global public good, that's effectively what every country does indirectly, even though they care only about their own welfare, they end up serving the global public good, the global good as well. The same is true about other policies that I've listed here, prudential, financial policy. The reason that countries want to have appropriate financial regulations is because they want to safeguard their own financial systems. If they do their job appropriately, they will also do what's appropriate for the world as a whole, in the sense of all countries following the appropriate financial policies. The same for fiscal policy, for tax policy, most other economic regulations I can think of. In all of these areas, the bottom line is that virtue is its own reward. If you follow economically virtuous policies from the standpoint of the national economic interest, you're actually also doing things that are good for the world economy at large. And that's a very big difference with the global commons or global public good. So the whole notion about talking about the world economy as a global commons or free trade policies, for example, being global public good, is simply confuses important concepts. So standard economic policies are not global public goods. The second generic case for global economic governance comes with beggar-thy-neighbor policies. Beggar-thy-neighbor policies, let's be clear in the definition, these are going to be policies that provide benefits at home only to the extent that they impose costs on foreign countries. So the most direct way of capturing this is to take that the utility function of every country has two terms. One is sort of a direct effect that comes from employing this policy. It would be standard part of the utility function. But then a second part, let's call that a transfer from the rest of the world kind of a function. That is going to depend on my policy vis-a-vis the other policy. Think about it, for example, in the case of tariff policies in a large country. A large country can manipulate its external terms of trade through tariffs. If I increase my tariff while other countries' tariffs are constant, I can improve my terms of trade, but the benefits are going to come from the terms of trade losses to other countries. So in that sense, my gain is exactly what the other country loses. Furthermore, with policies like import tariff, the situation is simply not zero sum, it's actually negative sum, because in trying to get those terms of trade benefits, I'm also driven to utilize import tariffs that are also too high, that are distorting consumer and production decisions domestically. And therefore, as that sort of little graph shows, I'm on the wrong side of the utility maximization, and I'm having a higher rate of the tariff because this is the way that I extract some terms of trade gains from my trade partners. So this is actually a negative sum policy. It creates a global inefficiency, but the gains come to me only to the extent that they provide losses for other countries. Now, in this case too, global economic governance can make all countries better off compared to the decentralized or Nash equilibrium where they're not cooperating. It's important to note an important caveat here is that in this case, there's no guarantee, if there is sufficient asymmetry across countries, that the cooperative equilibrium will necessarily make both countries better off relative to the decentralized Nash equilibrium. That's because if a country is very large, it may very well be better off in an equilibrium where it's extracting terms of trade gains from the rest of the world instead of binding itself through a free trade kind of a regime. Nonetheless, in beggar thy neighbor kinds of cases, I think there would be a strong presumption that global economic governance is desirable. So those are the easy cases. The issue is that most policies, in fact, as Avi said, are neither global public goods or bads, nor beggar thy neighbor policies. So I want to talk about these non-beggar thy neighbor policies under a couple of headings because it's also, this is really where sort of this is the bucket where most of our current policy discussions fall. So what are these non-beggar thy neighbor policies? Would be policies that do create spillovers, but either do not create a global inefficiency, or when they do, it's the home economy that bears the direct economic costs. So let me give you two very concrete examples. One is the example of an R&D subsidy in a country that imports knowledge-intensive goods. So we normally think of R&D subsidies as actually efficiency-enhancing policies because we believe the R&D process has significant positive externalities. But if a country subsidizes knowledge-intensive goods when it has a comparative disadvantage in knowledge-intensive goods, it will have an induced terms of trade effect. It will affect the rest of the world negatively. Right? So here's a case where you provide a negative spillover to the rest of the world. We might think it's globally efficient or not, but the spillover to the rest of the world is negative. Okay? But we wouldn't think that in this case there should be a global agreement on limiting countries' ability to provide R&D subsidies. The second example is an import ban on goods produced with slave labor. Okay? I don't think the GATT has an exception as a prison labor exception. Doesn't have an exception on slavery, but that's, I guess, because it's taken for granted that this is something that countries should be allowed to do. This is inefficient. Okay, this is how economists talk about things. It's inefficient because it creates a trade barrier, trade embargo or quota or trade restriction creates all this usual economic inefficiencies. But once again, it is the home economy that bears the economic costs of this inefficiency. And I think most of our moral intuition would be that, the country is trading off some upholding of some moral or ethical values domestically at the cost of this economic inefficiency of keeping cheap goods out. Okay? And we would say that's perfectly okay. The country should be allowed to do this. Okay? I hope I hope your intuitions on these two examples are with me. If they are, then I think we are going to have a trouble with all the other policies that I'm going to be bringing up, which we routinely talk in the context of global economic governance, but share one or the other of characteristics of these policies. So once again, the question becomes of why, are we drawing the dividing line between global and national governance inappropriately? First, let me dispose of a case which sort of sits very uneasily here, and which I will call enrich thy neighbor policies. So these are policies that actually, on balance, provide positive benefits to the rest of the world, but that might be actually inefficient from the domestic standpoint. So you would think, should there be at all any kind of effort to establish a global governance regime that restricts what countries can do in terms of providing benefits to the rest of the world, except that, of course, this is one of the areas where we're constantly struggling to arrive at some kind of global arrangement, and that's the area of subsidies. So in the case of subsidies, what's happening is, suppose now there's two foreign countries, and the home country subsidizes, it's exportable, and then these two foreign countries are affected asymmetrically. So foreign country F actually is affected negatively presumably because it shares the same pattern of comparative advantage with the subsidizing country. And country G is affected positively by the subsidy because it's symmetric. It has the reverse pattern of comparative advantage than the subsidizing country. After all, when countries subsidize, let's say, agricultural exports, the world price of agricultural goods falls, net importers of agricultural commodities benefit. Now, what we know is that since, by assumption, this country is subsidizing its exportables, the aggregate effect on the rest of the world has got to be positive because the rest of the world is, in aggregate, a net importer of this subsidized commodity. And so the terms of trade effects overall go in the right direction of providing net benefits to the rest of the world. So why should the world have any say, or why should we struggle about sort of providing restrictions on what countries can do in terms of how much they can subsidize their exportables? There are three arguments as to why this is still a question appropriate for global governance. I don't think they're very good, but let me tell them, I think this is sort of an exhaustive list, and let me know if I've missed anything. One argument is to say that some foreign countries lose. So countries that are producers, and this is of course the argument that the Keynes exporting group countries used in the trade negotiations. When other countries subsidize their exporters, we as producers of agricultural products lose out. Yeah, I mean, it's even when a country liberalizes its trade unilaterally, and we would never think of limiting a country's ability to unilaterally liberalize its trade, there will be some countries that might lose. Because if actually, they have the same comparative advantage pattern of the country that's unilaterally liberalizing its trade, they will also suffer in terms of trade loss on account of that trade liberalization of home country without any of the compensating benefits of improved resource allocation domestically due to trade liberalization, because the trade liberalization is being done somewhere else. So that would never be a valid argument. The fact that some countries lose is never a valid argument when, on balance, it's a policy that's sort of desirable for the rest of the world. Well, you might question, and that would be the second counter-argument, that the subsidies, unlike the unilateral trade liberalization, are globally inefficient. But the argument here might be that we don't necessarily know. There might be either economic reasons or social and political reasons that make this subsidization policy efficient or socially desirable from the perspective of the country that is implementing this policy. And so it becomes a secondary question of who should decide who should be deciding whether, in fact, the right policy objectives have been targeted for this policy. And the third argument is a kind of an unfair argument, an argument about unfairness, that policies like subsidies make the playing field unlevel. And if you want to have a market system, it has to be level. So I'm actually I'm very sympathetic to this argument, but I think the right remedy in circumstances like this, when there are questions about unlevel playing fields or unfairness, the right remedies are domestic rather than international. Because there are few areas where countries are going to agree on what is fair or not. For example, in the case of subsidies, developed countries might think it's unfair that developing countries are subsidizing their exports, but the developing countries might think that it's unfair that they're sort of technologically backward, that they're not trying to catch up. They're entering the world economy at a point where everybody else has already, or the rich countries have already achieved technological mastery. And so for them, the subsidies is just a way of compensating for this historical disadvantage. So they might put forth a fairness argument that actually cuts exactly in the opposite way. So in areas where we cannot arrive at a global agreement, consensus on what is fair, what is not fair, I think it would be appropriate to let individual countries decide for themselves, and if need be, to restrict those trades, that restrict relative trade on account of using some kind of a domestic procedure. In fact, the countervailing duty approach is very similar. I would extend it to areas like social dumping as well. But the point is that this is really largely a kind of a domestic remedy rather than a global discipline on whether subsidies can be used or not. Okay. Probably the largest category of policies are those that fall into this bucket. And these are policies that create spillovers, they're not beggar thy neighbor, and they have ambiguous domestic efficiency implications. Okay? So think about, I have a list of them here. It's not an exhaustive list, but this really covers a lot of the kinds of things that we talk about in the context of global governance or global cooperation. Everything from weak intellectual property rights protections to industrial policies to excessive fiscal austerity to lax financial regulations to trade protection that is used as social policy or for employment protection rather than necessarily fulfilling or fixing market failures. Sort of the important new area of internet regulation, the desire of many countries to build internet walls nationally through data localization and other kinds of policies. So typically the domestic effects of these kinds of things, it's very hard to evaluate them without having a full picture of what are the market distortions and beyond that, what are the various social objectives of these kinds of policies. And the question is there going to be a role for global economic governance here on account of that the combined characteristics that there are some grounds to believe that these might be inefficient and therefore not serving domestic social objectives appropriately. And secondly, that they provide negative spillovers for the rest of the world. Okay? Now, those who say that these would be then appropriate domains for global economic governments would have to, and do, make an argument that sort of roughly suggests that global rules effectively can prevent or reduce the incidence of countries using beggar thyself policies. In other words, that we can design global rules that somehow will be able to discriminate between the good cases and the bad cases. Or lacking that, will simply assume all of them are bad cases and simply will prevent countries from pursuing those divergent kinds of policies. I think the counter-argument for why this is not a good idea is basically three things. One is that, in fact, global rules, global dispute settlement procedures, global bureaucracies, the bureaucrats and the diplomats and the trade negotiators that agree on these agreements cannot reliably distinguish, in fact, between beggar thyself and economically and or socially desirable policies, and that this cannot be appropriately done by global agreement. Even when there is a presumption that these are economically inefficient, that in some sense democracies should be allowed to make their own mistakes. My favorite example there is the GMO ban in the EU. It's very difficult to make a case that it's economically, or even from a public health standpoint, it's harmful. Yet for sort of consumer demands and through a democratic process, the EU decides that there's going to ban. And we might all think that's a mistake, but it seems, it's very hard. I find it very hard to argue that this mistake arrived at through a kind of a legitimate democratic process should be overruled through trade agreement. And the third argument, which I think is extremely important, is that when people make the argument that international rules can be used to effectively influence domestic political economy equilibria in the right direction, presume that the rules are somehow written by sort of disinterested technocratic observers like you and me who really want the good for the world economy, for individual nations. But just like the domestic political process is the result of political economy bargaining and different lobbies and different interests, the international agreement, the international agreements and global economic governance is similarly a political domain where bargaining takes place. In a recent paper, I've argued that trade agreements increasingly have become captured by the special interests that until very recently we thought were the counterweight to the protectionists at home. The multinationals, the big bank, the export-oriented interests. So we thought that those were they were overwhelmed by protectionist interests, and they were useful allies of the international multilateral system because they were countervailing against these protectionist interests. But if you look at what's happened since the 1990s, is that the balance of power in the design of the international trade agreements or in the design of international banking standards has moved completely in the opposite direction. That is, the banks, it's the pharma, it's big tech, it's multinational corporations that are much more effective in writing the rules than the protectionists than we want. So basically, you have barbarians on both sides of the issue, and you cannot simply assume that the international domain is going to be less immune to these barbarians than the domestic domain is. And the national one, of course, has the advantage that in terms of basic democratic legitimacy, in terms of accountability mechanisms. So I think the best piece that I've read on this is actually by three political scientists, Bob Cohen, Steve Macedo, and Andy Moravchik, that was meant to be a defense of international organizations. And they're saying that the starting premise of that article was to say, look, people think that international organizations like the IMF or the World Bank or the WTO actually undermine democracy because they entail restrictions on what countries can do. And the argument made in this was that actually they help democracy, and they help democracy in three particular ways. And they call this democracy-enhancing multilateralism. And the three ways was by offsetting factions, that is prevent protectionist special interests from getting the upper hand domestically, by protecting minority rights. This is a bit of a less of an issue in economic governance, but it was a big issue in sort of domains like human rights. And third, by enhancing the quality of democratic deliberation, for example, by asking for explicit scientific assessment of policies in certain domains before countries are allowed to do certain kinds of things. But it's possible to flip the Cohen et al. Argument exactly on its head and to say, well, just because multilateral institutions can enhance democracy, it doesn't mean that they always will, and there are in fact many ways in which these three arguments work in exactly the opposite fashion. That is, that instead of offsetting factions, that it empowers factions. Of course, the intellectual property rights regime globally is a wonderful example of this, how it empowered pharma to establish and achieve rules globally in ways that they were unable to do otherwise. And in terms of the quality of democratic deliberation, there are sort of many mechanisms. You will all be familiar, for example, ways in which, sort of the IMF made me do it is an example for cutting, is an argument used to cut off the domestic deliberation, right? Because you say, well, we have no choice. The IMF made us do it. And that's not very, positive from the standpoint of democratic deliberation. So, interestingly, one of the three authors here, Bob Cohen, sort of changed his mind on this. A couple of years earlier, previously published a piece where he now said that the liberal international order had been rigged by these special interests. So far from enhancing democracy, that the liberal international order had become captured by interests of the wealthy and corporations and banks and so forth. But rather than taking this approach of democracy-enhancing multilateralism as a positive description of how the world operates, and I think there's a lot of reason to believe that that's not how it currently operates, I think it's useful to take it as a normative principle. That is to say that, yeah, we like this. This is how international organizations should operate. So that should be our normative principle for what it is that instead, in fact, they do. So I think the strongest argument for some form of global economic governance in that large bucket of non-BTN policies, the best argument is to think about global economic governance as enunciating and developing over time a series of procedural norms that are directly targeted at improving the quality of democracies and quality of democratic deliberation. So this would be directed at enforcing those norms without prejudging the outcomes of the policy process. So you might get very lax IPRs, you might get a very divergent system of banking regulation, you might get a lot of trade protection, but the emphasis would be on let's see if we can develop global norms about how these decisions are made. So norms such as transparency in the process, accountability, the participation of all relevant stakeholders in the decision-making process, and the systematic use of economic and scientific evidence in the domestic proceedings, but without a presumption of harmonization of common rules or ceilings on the policies. Okay? So I've tried to think about how something like this might apply for, if you will, the mother of beggar thyself policies, Trump's national security justification for tariffs. I would be silly if I were to believe that anything like this would affect whether Trump in the end was able to apply these tariffs at home or not. But if there was no doubt that the system allows a country to use such justifications, and there's some ambiguity in the current GATT as to whether such national security tariffs are going to be allowed or allowable or not. But if there was no such ambiguity, in fact, the presumption was that countries can beggar themselves in this fashion, as long as it's not clearly a beggar thy neighbor policy, then at the very least, such a proceduralist approach would deprive leaders such as Trump from this crutch that they have, which is that, look at these global institutions that are undermining our democracy, undermining our sovereignty. Because at least it would deprive, even if it were not effective in reversing these policies, at least it would remove a justification or remove an argument to delegitimize the global economic institutions. So I've argued that what this kind of approach to global economic governance would do would be something that was much more, I would call it, democracy-enhancing globalization, and it's sort of to be distinguished from globalization-enhancing global governance. And the distinction here is in this, and let me relate this to sort of in the last couple of minutes. To this idea of the trilemma that I've written on and off for now nearly 20 years. When I first drew this picture, it was purely a fantasy, and I think it's become real in ways that I had not imagined at the time, partly in the Eurozone. But the trilemma says that of the following three things: hyperglobalization, that is a almost completely integrated world economy on the one hand, national sovereignty, and then mass politics. You can have at most two out of those three things. The genius of the Bretton Woods regime, which came to an end, by the way. So the multilateralism of the Bretton Woods regime was one that's much more in line with the sort of more limited global economic governance model that I've drawn here, because it didn't reach behind the borders, it left countries with significant amounts of autonomy. I think that was the genius of the Bretton Woods regime. It was the genius of John Maynard Keynes, who had seen what the gold standard model had done in the interwar period, that the moment you have a country's economy be run or perceived as being run by the demands of the international economy, then that not only do you create trouble domestically, but you also undermine confidence and trust in the international economic arrangement. And therefore, Keynes was very clear that the post-war international economic arrangements would have to be one where you have to leave significant autonomy for domestic economic management. He was, of course, thinking of what today we call Keynesian macroeconomic management, but a very similar set of arrangements came into play in the GATT too, which surprisingly little discipline in terms of what countries were and could not do. So let me end with this quote I saw recently from Christine Lagarde. And it's an interesting quote about the Bretton Woods. It says, Bretton Woods launched a new era of global economic cooperation in which countries help themselves by helping each other. And I think that actually the logic of the Bretton Woods system was exactly the opposite. That what the Bretton Woods regime achieved is that countries helped each other by being allowed to help themselves first. And the reason that global trade and investment increased so rapidly under that era was in fact that there was all this room for them to experiment with their own economic policies and their economic models. And that idea went by the wayside in the 1990s as we start to push in this era of hyperglobalization. And I think we've moved into a lot of areas that are much more appropriately left to national discussions, and I don't think can really be justified. And that's been sort of the argument that I've made. So thinner global economic governance, I think, would actually make for a better, healthier, and more sustainable globalization as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny. Very interesting and thought-provocative, as expected. So I expect there will be many questions and comments, and we don't have much time, but let me just offer a quick reaction. I agree with many of the points you made, but let me just play devil's advocate on a couple of points. First, in your presentation, you seem to identify global governance with complete harmonization of rules, which I think no reasonable person would completely advocate. Just to pick on a specific topic that I've written about myself, intellectual property rights. I think there was consensus among academics and policymakers that complete harmonization of intellectual property rights between developed and developing countries was not prudent from an economic point of view. But this does not mean necessarily that we shouldn't negotiate about them or try to find some common ground. So there is a difference there. But more importantly, I think that the point you make, and people may not completely agree with that, is that fundamentally there are two reasons to have multilateral agreements. Either we have global public goods or these beggar-thy-neighbor policies. And your point is that there are very few cases, very few issues that fit this profile. So I would argue there that perhaps the most important global public good is peace. And by that I don't mean just peace in the military domain, but also in the economic domain. A war, an economic war, is very costly to everyone. So in many cases, the justification for international cooperation, not necessarily harmonization, but cooperation, arises from the possibility that when countries pursue national policies, even though these national policies may be rational from their own point of view, in the case of subsidies, for example, there could be retaliation by other countries. And this may put countries in a prisoner's dilemma. And we can avoid this prisoner's dilemma by sitting at the negotiation table and try to establish some common rules. So it's no coincidence that the two examples you picked, so the one about slave labor and the one about knowledge subsidies, these are cases where if we had retaliation, so if we had reciprocity by foreign governments, we would actually have something positive. We would have a race to the top, right? So if we impose an import ban on goods produced by slave labor, and foreign governments respond by doing the same, so they put import bans on goods that also use slave labor, then the result would be to eliminate slave labor. So we'll have a race to the top and the global good. So that's why we are in favor of it. And similarly, if we invest in, if we provide subsidies for knowledge-intensive sectors and foreign governments reciprocate by doing the same, we have a race to the top. The economy, the world as a whole benefit from that, and that's, I think, part of the reason we don't object to it. On the other hand, if we provide subsidies, as was the case in the 90s for strategic reasons in order to shift profits to our own country, from an economic point of view, it may seem very rational, but if the foreign country responds by doing exactly the same, then we have exactly the same problem we have in the case of tax havens, namely a race to the bottom, right? It's the classic externality. So that's, I think, that's the main reason. This type of externality arises much more commonly than in the cases you cover, and I think that's the main case for international agreements.
Yeah, thank you, Penny. Well, I mean, on the sort of the prisoner's dilemma nature, I mean, I think your characterization of the examples I gave is correct, that from our normative standpoint, that if all countries were playing the R&D subsidization game or banning imports of slave labor, we would consider it appropriate, and many of the other examples might not have that nature. But I'm not sure. I think once again that is, whether you take a perfectly competitive, sort of benchmark as the yardstick or not makes a huge amount of difference. For example, in your example of subsidies in the 1990s, I mean, the best known case of that was the subsidies, the wide-bodied aircraft, Boeing versus Airbus. And here is a case where, we're a duopoly, presumption of large monopoly rents, presumably shared with workers as well. And there's you can make a very good case, actually, that you do want, a race in subsidies between US and Europe in that case, because the rest of the world benefits, and the subsidy is one way that you can have, you can alleviate the duopoly distortion in an industry where there is underproduction. And so I'm not sure in cases like subsidies is the economic logic that has been the dominant one, except for the fact that once again, certain interests have prevailed. The intellectual property rights case, you're absolutely right that, I mean, we're never talking about perfect harmonization, but it was very clear that developing countries were pushed into intellectual property rights protection levels that were way above what they had or what they would have done on their own, and that has become, we started with the WTO, and every subsequent regional trade agreement has taken a kind of a WTO plus approach in intellectual property rights, has gone further. Now, you might say, well, what's wrong with this? I mean, countries are just basically trading off losses here vis-a-vis gains there. But it's very important to be clear about what a country is doing when it's entering a contract. If we present this as a kind of, internalization of global externalities, or solving a collective action problem, or fixing economic problems, then you have a kind of a narrative advantage in the domestic political fight over these things that I don't think you ought to have. So, for example, in the case of intellectual property rights, what happens when the United States extracts intellectual property rights advantages, let's say in the context of the, not ratified TPP would have been, essentially there was an agreement where the United States extracts intellectual property right advantages from these other countries. In return, it opens up its labor market to imports from those countries, and therefore imposes a distributional cost on some segments of the labor force. Now, it's one way to present this trade agreement as, what I'm doing? I'm just basically making a lot of these big tech and big pharma companies very, very rich and very happy. In return, you know, sort of some of my worst paid workers are going to be adversely affected by this agreement. And the net is really basically, you know, sort of, you know, second order, that we can't really even decide whether it's on the positive side of zero. You know, that's a very different way of selling a trade agreement than selling it in the way, with often the support of our kind of economic argumentation, that this is really about, you know, supporting, you know, the world economy, or, you know, solving collective action or prisoner's dilemma kind of problems. And I think so we need to be very clear about sort of, you know, what's happening with these agreements, but I think unpacking these, what's behind them, which is my argument. I couldn't agree more with you that that's really, I mean, the central objective really to be to establish a stable, peaceful international economic order. We don't want trade wars. But that's the whole point. Right now, I think we have a war between US and China in the trade domain because we've been living under the, you know, implicit understanding that China would effectively become a market economy just like us. That China's entry into WTO was predicated that their policies would more or less converge, not completely be harmonized, obviously, but in the area of subsidies, intellectual property rights, technology transfer, local content, all this, they would sort of converge. Well, this is not happening, and there's good reason it's not happening and why it shouldn't happen. So my argument would be that we would have, you know, we're much more likely to have peace in the international economic domain, sort of what I call, you know, peaceful economic coexistence, if we go into much more of a live and let live kind of a understanding, rather than sort of try to, for example, the US, you know, force sort of, you know, its own conception of what intellectual property rights or technology transfer agreements ought to be on China. I understand that they're going to have a different economic, and the US will have different reasons to protect its own integrity of its own technological systems and labor standards. And that might, you know, require a very different type of agreement that doesn't force some convergence on these economic policies, but instead internalizes that they're going to remain different, and the nature of the agreement becomes much more in the nature of traffic rules and providing the interface rather than trying to impose a common set of so I'm sorry, I've gone on too long, and there might be some questions or comments from the floor too.
Yes, so we could debate these topics forever, but let me let me take questions. Let me turn it over to the floor. Do you want to come to the microphone? And thank you. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. My name is Phil. I'm a social anthropologist at Harvard. I have a question. Currency devaluation. Can you walk us through that example? Is that something that is that on the national domain? Because I feel like there's an interaction between that and other things in the toolkit if we're talking about competition. So I just want to know where currency plays, where do they sit within some of these case examples? Thanks.
Do you want to take 3 questions?
Yeah, very quick. I mean, I think in a world where generalized unemployment, sorry. Is my voice clear? In a world with generalized unemployment, sort of competitive devaluation would be sort of like another example of a beggar-thy-neighbor policy, because, you know, you're getting some employment gains from undervaluing your currency, but that comes at the expense of stealing demand from your trade partners, and so that would be next to you know, the optimum tariff argument, another sort of classic example of a beggar-thy-neighbor policy.
Sorry. We have 5 more minutes, so.
Okay, thanks. Christian Eigenzuki, I'm a program leader working on Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal. I like the emphasis on the norms and rules for engaging, and I wonder whether you could say more about size differences in terms of how countries engage, because it seems that Trump, for example, wants to use, you know, to discard multilateralism and go more on the bilateral basis, big versus small all over the world with the hope of getting more advantages. And I guess I would always thought that the multilateral system, that part of the benefit of that is to, in fact, help protect the small players.
No, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's why I said at the outset that it was, the one important and very, very useful element of the multilateral system that I was not going to talk about was the non-discrimination norm. So that goes with the idea that you treat all countries the same regardless of power, size, and all of that. So so I'm all with you there. I just simply didn't focus on that issue.
Tony Carroll, I'm a adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins, SAIS. It seems to be the rubber meets the road politically is to the perceived benefits of multilateral trading systems. And as yesterday it was, a statistic was thrown out that 80% of Americans feel that their lot in life is worse off than it was a generation before. Italy is something approaching 90%, I believe, of the statistic. So how can has trade adjustment assistance ever worked well for those category of people that you said at the bottom that fall out because we're making mega agreements on intellectual property, but perhaps throwing the people under the bus that are more wage-dependent type of jobs? Has trade adjustment assistance ever worked well in any economy that isn't seen as a complete drag on the overall macroeconomy of that country?
Trade adjustment assistance certainly has not worked well in the United States, and for a very obvious political motive that is always used as a carrot to bring labor on board when the agreement is signed. But once the agreement is signed, there's very little political motivation to make sure that it's appropriately working and funded. So therefore, in the United States, it hasn't worked. Where it does work is where it's not an add-on, but you have a very robust system of social safety nets and redistribution that is independent of whether you're signing a trade agreement or not. So in much of Western Europe, actually, the system has worked very well. So in Western Europe, you don't get a lot of opposition to trade from China or trade from low-income countries because the welfare state has done a pretty good job of taking care of people at the very bottom. Now, you get opposition to trade agreements on account of different things, the kinds of issues that I focused on with respect to, beyond the border rules and intrusion on that domain. But it's not about their specifically labor market implications.
Good morning, Roberto Chandi, Trade Unit, World Bank. I understand, Professor Roderick, that you said that you didn't want to talk about the MFN and the non-discrimination, but how would all these that we have discussed change or affect if we did? If we take into consideration the point that was raised by my colleague before?
I mean, I think the general principles I've described of what a democracy-enhancing global economic governance arrangements would look like would apply to are meant to apply in a multilateral setting. So these would be multilateral rules. They wouldn't be negotiated bilaterally between the U.S. and China, even though, as a practical matter, it may well be that this settlement will first take place between these two big players and then be reflected subsequently in a multilateral arrangement. But the objective is to really multilateralize these norms. And again, I don't want to oversell what these norms will achieve. Countries can very easily go around them. But I think the important thing is to elevate these norms rather than elevate the idea that what we're engaged in an act of exchanging market access. Which, by the way, is I would say inherently disadvantages small countries because small countries have small markets to exchange.
So I'm afraid our time is up. We're already 10 minutes late. So thank you all very much for coming to the session. Of course, thank you very much, Dani.